Got to say, my dad, a former engineer, very involved in the first space race to get a man on the moon back in the 1960s. Here we are more than 50 years afterwards, and we're going back. Why is everybody going back to the moon?
Well, I think from one person that I spoke to, it's a place that we went and we've always wanted to go back ever since. You know, after the Apollo program, we've kind of been, I don't want to say stuck in low Earth orbit, but we've definitely much more focused on the space that is closer to home, right? We had the reusable space shuttle, and then we created the International Space Station. And those two programs have been kind of the primary focus of NASA for the last few decades. But now there's kind of this idea that, you know, we've been there and we've done that with low Earth orbit. We don't want to leave, but we want to keep going. And so I think the moon provides a really attractive place to send people. And, you know, kind of at the heart of NASA, they like to have a big flagship, you know, human spaceflight program to move the needle forward. And so that, you know, the moon is the next logical step for us to go.
Does it, Loren, set us up for a mission to Mars? Is that the next step following what happens with Artemis II? It's
certainly something that they hope will allow us to learn more about what it will take to live on the surface of Mars, right? So the moon has a lot of advantages in that it's close, and so we can potentially get there in a much shorter amount of time than it would take to get to Mars. It could serve as someplace a little bit like our outposts in Antarctica, right? We can send supplies there. We can bring people back a little more quickly if we need to. It still poses quite a lot of challenges, but it will give us kind of this proving ground on what it will take to live off of another surface. And then we can take those lessons and then apply them to Mars living, which is going to be a much more substantial challenge because we will not be able to come and go between Mars very easily. And the communication delay between us and Mars is also can become quite significant. So any astronauts that will live on the red planet will have to be much more autonomous than the ones that will be on the moon.
You know, what's interesting, Loren, and it's not just the U.S. You guys highlight China and what they're doing, and I'm assuming there might be other nations looking at it as well. But I just, I think about the International Space Lab, and there was kind of collaboration and joint. These are not inexpensive ventures, but by countries separately focusing on it, it sounds like it's important, whether it leads to technological developments, whether there's a weapon, defense aspect of it. I mean, walk us through why this maybe bigger term, longer term is so important.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are so many different reasons and benefits that are invoked as to why we go back to the moon. I kind of laid out the existential reason, but, there's been discussion about jumpstarting the so-called lunar economy. So finding ways to make money off the moon. Potentially, those will probably be in service to the space world. So making it easier to live in near the moon. Maybe not necessarily applications for back on Earth right away, but we can find that out when we get there, right? You also talked about China. There's a lot of discussion about whether, we should be the ones to get back to the moon before China lands its astronauts there. There's a lot of concern about, China potentially making it more difficult for us to explore the moon in the ways that we want if they were to set up some kind of, perimeter. Obviously, that is a very long-term scare, but that is what is invoked as to why we need to get there. And then there's also discussion of the moon as the ultimate high ground, as it were. So, the farther you are in space, the better vantage point you could have with assets in orbit around Earth. So lots of discussion about, why we need to get back, what we'll do when we get there, but first we just need to get there, and that's taking a bit of time, as you can tell.
And NASA is in a moment of truth. It really needs to prove itself and prove that the money that it's spent on this is of good use. You noted in the Bloomberg Originals piece that we started with, Loren, that there have been a lot of detractors, and you showed a Bloomberg opinion piece from a couple of years ago that said that this is a giant waste of taxpayer money. What's the position that NASA finds itself in right now, and how does that compare to the first space race and how NASA was looked at, not just by lawmakers, but by Americans?
Yeah, absolutely. I think NASA is certainly faced with needing to show that it can execute on these ambitious programs. The rocket and the capsule that are flying potentially tomorrow have been in development well over a decade now. They had their first flight together back in 2022, an uncrewed mission, and here we are in 2026. That's a big gap between those two flights. And so there's a lot of criticism about how slow the project has been, how much money, each time they delay or there's, another year that goes by that costs more money to keep the programs going. And so there's been many cost overruns, billions of dollars over budget. And so at some point, people have floated canceling. At this point, I think they're trying to show, okay, let's take the vehicles that we have developed and accelerate. So there's a lot of enthusiasm now, especially with the new administrator, Jared Isaacman, to ramp up the launch cadence for these missions, to go more quickly and to do even more ambitious things with the money that they have invested into this program. He's called for a lot of new changes, a lot of really ambitious goals. And so, there's not a long time to get those things done. So we'll see if he can actually accomplish them during his time as the administrator.
What's interesting too, Loren, you've got Boeing involved, Lockheed Martin, like your kind of traditional iconic defense companies and space companies, if you will. But it's interesting. We have seen from when my dad was involved, it was all government work, government contracts, but working for the government. Now you've got kind of the private space exploration industry, whether it's Elon Musk, whether it's Jeff Bezos. Why not? Some might say, why not just leave it to the private sector to figure this out? Just got about a minute left.
Sure. Well, that's what's so interesting about Artemis, right? It's a bit of a mashup of the old and new way of doing space. So you mentioned Boeing and Lockheed. Their contracts are very much the old NASA way. NASA oversees them, pays the entire bill, and then owns the vehicles when they're done. But the lunar landers that are being developed for Artemis from SpaceX and Blue Origin, they're much more outsourced, with NASA putting in partial investment money, but then the companies will own those vehicles when they are done. They're two conflicting approaches. And it still remains to be seen whether one is the better way or the other. So I think we'll have to revisit that question later on down the road.
20 seconds, pretty cool down there right now?
It's actually, I come to Florida often for these launches. The weather is pristine and I can't complain. And that's not always the case when I come here. So I'm looking forward to it.